The year was 1892, and in the windswept prairies of Nebraska Territory, where wheatfields stretched endlessly toward the horizon and dreams were built on promises carried by wind and railroad tracks, a young woman named Eleanor Hartwell was about to step off a train, carrying a secret that would shatter two families and reveal that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in the gentle lies we tell ourselves about love. Her story began not with hope, but with the kind of desperation that makes good people do unthinkable things. It was a tale that would stretch across dusty farming communities, through the sacred bonds of brotherhood, and into the heart of what it truly meant to honor the promises we make to both the living and the dead. But to understand how Eleanor Hartwell came to stand on a railway platform in Milbrook, Nebraska, clutching a 6-month-old baby whose very existence would expose secrets buried deeper than winter wheat, we must first journey back to where it all began. In a cramped tenement in Boston's North End, where poverty wore the mask of respectability and survival demanded sacrifices that no mother should ever have to make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a boy whose dirty fingers left smudges on the yellow paper that would forever change Eleanor's understanding of her own life. She stood in the narrow hallway of Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house, still wearing her nightgown and wrapper, reading words that seemed to rearrange themselves before her eyes like some cruel magic trick. Thomas Whitfield died September 30th. Stop consumption. Took him fast. Stop. Come home immediately. Stop. Arrangements made. Stop. Father. Eleanor's legs gave way beneath her, and she sank onto the wooden stairs that led to her third-floor room. The baby in her arms stirred at the sudden movement, his tiny fist escaping from the blanket she had wrapped around him with such careful precision. Little James. She had named him for his father, though she had never been able to tell Thomas about his son's existence, opened his blue eyes and studied her face with the solemn intensity that babies sometimes possess. 6 months old, and he would never know the man whose eyes he had inherited, whose stubborn cowlick defied every attempt to tame it, whose gentle smile had convinced Eleanor that love was possible even for girls like her, who had nothing to offer but hope and determination. The boarding house around her buzzed with the usual morning activities. Mrs. O'Malley's heavy footsteps on the floor below, the sound of other tenants preparing for another day of work in the textile mills that provided employment for most of the neighborhood's residents. But Eleanor felt suspended in a bubble of silence, holding her son and contemplating a future that had just become infinitely more complicated. Thomas Whitfield had been everything she wasn't supposed to want. The son of a prosperous Nebraska farmer, educated at the State University, visiting Boston on business for his father's grain operation. She was a seamstress in a factory where lint filled the air like snow and the machines never stopped their relentless clatter. Their worlds should never have intersected, except for a chance encounter at the train station where she had been waiting to see off her friend Mary, who was leaving for a position as a governess in Chicago. Thomas had been struggling with directions to his hotel, clearly overwhelmed by the chaos of the city. Eleanor had offered to help, and somehow that 5-minute conversation had stretched into an afternoon walk, then dinner at a respectable restaurant, then a courtship that lasted 3 months and changed everything she thought she knew about her own possibilities. He had promised to marry her, had spoken of taking her back to Nebraska, of introducing her to his family, of building a life together on the farm that would someday be his inheritance. They had made plans, shared dreams, created a future together in whispered conversations. In the boarding house parlor, after Mrs. O'Malley had retired for the evening, And then Thomas had received word that his father needed him home immediately. A crisis with the harvest, problems with creditors, family obligations that couldn't be postponed. He would return for her in the spring, he promised. He would write every week. He would send money for her passage west as soon as the farm's finances stabilized. The letters had come regularly for 2 months, long, detailed accounts of life in Milbrook, descriptions of the house where she would live, plans for their wedding that would take place as soon as he could arrange it properly. Eleanor had treasured every word, reading them until the paper grew soft from handling, sharing carefully edited portions with Mrs. O'Malley, who had developed a soft spot for romance, despite her practical nature. But then the letters had stopped. Weeks passed without word, then months. Eleanor had written increasingly desperate messages, wondering if something had happened to Thomas, if his family had discovered their relationship and forbidden further contact, if he had simply changed. His mind about marrying a factory girl from Boston's tenements. By the time she realized she was carrying his child, Eleanor had already begun to understand that Thomas Whitfield might be lost to her forever. The pregnancy was difficult, complicated, by poor nutrition and the stress of trying to maintain her job while hiding her condition. She had managed to work until her 7th month, saving every penny possible, before Mrs. O'Malley had quietly suggested that certain arrangements might need to be made. The birth had been attended by a midwife who asked no questions and accepted payment in installments. Eleanor had spent her confinement in a room at the back of the boarding house, listening to the sounds of normal life continuing around her, while she struggled to understand how she would survive as an unmarried mother with no family support and rapidly dwindling savings. Now, holding the telegram that announced Thomas's death, Eleanor understood that her situation had moved beyond difficult into the realm of impossible. Whatever hopes she might have harbored about eventual reunion, about explanations and forgiveness and second chances, had died with the man whose name her son would never legally carry. Mrs. O'Malley found her still sitting on the stairs an hour. Later, staring at the telegram as if it might spontaneously rewrite itself with better news. The older woman's Irish practicality had been tempered by years of caring for young women in various states of crisis, and she settled herself beside Eleanor with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested every change in weather. "Bad. News from home, is it?" Mrs. O'Malley asked, though her tone suggested she had already guessed the nature of the message. Eleanor handed her the telegram without speaking. Mrs. O'Malley read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she parsed the formal language, then folded the paper with deliberate care and handed it back. "The baby's father, then," she said. It wasn't really a question. Eleanor nodded, unable to trust her voice. Mrs. O'Malley had never asked directly about James's parentage, but she was an observant woman who had seen enough of life to understand the patterns that led young women to her establishment. "Well," Mrs. O'Malley said after a moment, "the dead can't marry you, but they can't abandon you either. Sometimes that's a kind of blessing, though it doesn't feel like one at the time." The practicality of the statement should have been comforting, but Eleanor found herself fighting tears that had nothing to do with self-pity and everything to do with the weight of secrets she would now carry alone. Thomas would never know about his son, James would never know his father, and she would spend the rest of her life explaining to herself and others how she had come to be raising a child whose very existence testified to choices that proper society would never forgive. "What will you do?" Mrs. O'Malley asked gently. Eleanor looked down at James, who had fallen asleep in her arms, with the complete trust that babies place in the world around them. He had no understanding of legitimacy or illegitimacy, of social conventions or economic realities. He simply existed, completely and utterly dependent on her ability to navigate a world that had no place for either of them. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "I have perhaps 2 months of rent saved, maybe 3, if I'm very careful. After that, She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Mrs. O'Malley was quiet for several minutes, studying Eleanor's face with the kind of attention that suggested she was making calculations that went beyond simple arithmetic. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience and hard-won wisdom. "There are options," she said carefully. "Not good ones, perhaps, but options nonetheless. There are families who might take the child. Good families, with means to provide what you cannot." Eleanor's arms tightened involuntarily around James. She had heard whispers about such arrangements, about women who gave up their children to strangers in hopes of providing them with better lives. The thought of surrendering the only piece of Thomas she had left was unbearable, even though she knew it might be the most loving thing she could do. "I can't," she whispered. "I won't." Mrs. O'Malley nodded, as if she'd expected this response. "Then you'll need to find another way. Marriage, most likely. A man willing to take on both you and the child. No questions asked." The suggestion hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The idea of marrying someone other than Thomas, of pretending to love another man while carrying the secret of James's true parentage, seemed like a betrayal of everything she had felt for the man whose death had just shattered her world. But as she sat on those narrow stairs, holding her son and contemplating a future that offered nothing but poverty and shame, Eleanor began to understand that betrayal might be a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival required compromises that love would never permit, and she was no longer just responsible for her own fate. That evening, after James had been fed and settled for the night, Eleanor sat at the small writing desk in her room and composed a letter that would change her life forever. Her hands shook as she wrote, not from cold, but from the enormity of what she was committing to, the lies she was preparing to tell, the deception she was about to weave around an innocent man who deserved honesty but would receive carefully. Crafted fiction instead, the letter was addressed to Mr. William Whitfield, Milbrook, Nebraska. Thomas's older brother, the man who would now inherit the farm that should have been Thomas's, the person who might feel enough obligation to his dead brother's memory to help the woman Thomas had loved. Eleanor had never met William, but Thomas had spoken of him often. 10 years older, more serious, less romantic, but utterly reliable. A man who had sacrificed his own youth to help build the family farm, who had remained unmarried because he believed his first duty was to his parents and their land. A man who might understand the value of promises kept and debts honored. "Dear Mr. Whitfield," Eleanor wrote, her pen scratching across the paper like tiny claws. "I am writing to express my condolences on the loss of your brother Thomas, who was a dear friend during his time in Boston. I understand this may seem presumptuous, but Thomas often spoke of you and your family with such affection that I feel I know you, though we have never met." She paused, staring at the words that looked so innocent on the paper, but carried the weight of everything she was about to risk. The next sentences would commit her to a path from which there might be no return. "I am writing also to inquire whether you might consider a business arrangement that could benefit us both. I am a widow with a young child, skilled in domestic arts and educated sufficiently to assist with correspondence and accounts. My circumstances require that I seek new employment, preferably in a location where my late husband's debts cannot follow us." The lie about being a widow came easier than she had expected. It was, in a sense, true. Thomas's death had left her in precisely the situation a widow would face, even if the law would never recognize her claim to that status. "Thomas mentioned that you were seeking a wife, someone who could help manage the household and provide companionship during the long Nebraska winters. If such an arrangement would still be of interest to you, I would be honored to discuss terms. I ask only for honest work, fair treatment, and safety for myself and my child." Eleanor sealed the letter before she could reconsider, addressing it with careful precision and calculating how long it might take for a response to reach her. 2 weeks for her letter to arrive, perhaps longer for William to consider his answer. Another 2 weeks for his reply to reach Boston. A month, maybe 6 weeks, before she would know whether this desperate gamble had any chance of success. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about the stories Mrs. O'Malley sometimes told about the mail-order brides who had passed through the boarding house over the years. Women who had exchanged letters with strange men, who had traveled thousands of miles to marry people they had never met, who had built lives on foundations of hope and necessity rather than love and choice. Some of those stories had ended well. Women who had found kindness and even affection with husbands who valued their practical skills and grateful hearts. Others had ended in disappointment, incompatibility, sometimes outright tragedy, when reality failed to match the promises contained in carefully worded letters. Eleanor understood that she was about to join their ranks, to become another woman, whose future depended on the honesty and character of a stranger. But unlike the other mail-order brides Mrs. O'Malley had known, Eleanor carried a secret that could destroy any marriage before it truly began. William Whitfield would be expecting, a widow with a child whose father was safely dead and buried, whose past was tragic but comprehensible. Instead, he would be getting a woman whose son was his own nephew, whose relationship with his dead brother had been everything he would assume it was not. The deception made Eleanor sick with guilt, but she could see no alternative that didn't involve watching James grow up in poverty or surrendering him to strangers who would erase every trace of his true heritage. She was gambling everything on the hope that William Whitfield was the kind of man his brother had believed him to be, honorable, generous, and capable of love that transcended the circumstances of its origin. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor dreamed of Whitfields stretching endlessly toward the horizon, of a house where James could grow up safe and loved, of a future built on lies that might somehow become the foundation for something honest and good. In her dreams, Thomas smiled and forgave her for the choices she was about to make in his son's name. But when morning came, Eleanor woke to the sound of James crying and the knowledge that dreams, however beautiful, could not change the harsh realities of survival in a world that offered few second chances to women who had already made one irreversible mistake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The response from William Whitfield arrived 3 weeks later, delivered on a grey November morning when frost painted the boarding house windows in delicate patterns that reminded Eleanor of the lace curtains she had once dreamed of hanging. In her own home, the envelope was thick and substantial, made from quality paper that spoke of prosperity and careful consideration, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she carried it upstairs to the privacy of her room. James was sleeping in the wooden crate that served as his cradle, positioned near the small coal stove that provided their only source of heat. At 7 months old, he had begun to show distinct personality traits that reminded Eleanor painfully of his father. A stubborn determination when he wanted something, a way of studying faces as if memorizing every detail, and moments of unexpected joy that transformed his entire expression into pure sunlight. Eleanor settled into the room's single chair and carefully opened the envelope, noting the precise handwriting that covered 3 full pages of cream-colored stationery. William Whitfield, it seemed, was not a man who believed in brief correspondence or hasty decisions. "Dear Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield," the letter began, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at seeing herself addressed with Thomas's surname, as if William had already accepted the fiction she had created about their relationship. "Your letter reached me during a time of great difficulty for our family. The loss of my brother Thomas has left us all struggling to understand how to move forward without his presence. He was not just my brother, but my closest friend and partner in all the work we do here on the farm. His absence feels like a wound that may never properly heal. Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the sharp stab of guilt that accompanied every reminder of Thomas's death. She had loved him truly, completely, but her love had been selfish in ways she was only beginning to understand. While she had been waiting for him to return to Boston, he had been dying alone in Nebraska, surrounded by family who never knew about her existence or the child who carried his blood. "Thomas spoke of you in his letters," William continued, and Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. "He mentioned a young woman in Boston who had shown him kindness during his business there, though he was characteristically modest about the nature of your friendship. I understand now that his feelings were deeper than he revealed to his family, and I regret that his illness prevented him from bringing you home as he apparently intended." The letter went on to describe the Whitfield farm in detail. 1,500 acres of prime wheat and corn land, a substantial house built by William's grandfather, outbuildings that included a modern dairy operation and the newest farm equipment available. It was a prosperous operation that supported not only William and his aging parents, but also employed several families from the surrounding community. "I will speak plainly about my circumstances," William wrote. "I am 35 years old and have remained unmarried not from lack of interest in family life, but because the demands of building and maintaining this farm have left little time for courtship. My parents are elderly and require increasing care, particularly my mother, whose health has declined significantly since Thomas's death. We are in need of someone who can manage the household, assist with my father's correspondence and accounts, and provide the kind of feminine influence that makes a house truly a home." Eleanor paused in her reading to check on James, who had begun to stir restlessly in his makeshift bed. She lifted him carefully, settling him against her shoulder while continuing to read William's carefully considered proposal. "I understand that you have a young child, and I want to assure you that this would not be seen as a burden, but rather as a blessing. This house has been quiet too long, and the sound of children's laughter would bring joy to my parents in their declining years. I'm prepared to provide for your child as if he were my own son, to ensure his education and future prospects regardless of his parentage." The generosity of the offer overwhelmed Eleanor, even as she recognized the irony that William was unknowingly promising to care for his own nephew. She wondered what he would think if he knew the truth, whether his kindness would survive the revelation that the child he was prepared to adopt already carried Whitfield blood, that her supposed late husband was entirely fictional. "As for the terms of our arrangement," William continued, "I propose a marriage of convenience that could, with time and mutual respect, develop into something deeper. I cannot promise love at first sight, as I believe such things exist more in novels than in real life, but I can promise honesty, kindness, and a genuine desire to build a partnership that benefits us both. You would have your own room initially, with no expectations beyond those of a housekeeper and companion, unless and until you felt comfortable with a more intimate arrangement." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes at the thoughtfulness behind William's words. He was offering her not just survival, but dignity, a chance to rebuild her life without the desperate urgency that had characterized every decision since James's birth. More importantly, he was offering her son a future that included education, opportunity, and the kind of stability she could never provide alone. "If these terms are acceptable to you, I would be honored to send funds for your passage to Nebraska. The journey will be difficult with a young child, but I can arrange for comfortable accommodations and assistance during travel. Mrs. Henderson, who manages our household accounts, has connections with families along the route who could provide support if needed." The letter concluded with practical details about train schedules, travel arrangements, and the seasonal timing that would be most suitable for making such a long journey with an infant. William had clearly thought through every aspect of the proposal, anticipating challenges and preparing solutions with the methodical thoroughness that seemed to characterize his approach to life. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before setting it aside and staring out the frost-covered window at the narrow alley that separated Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house from the tenement building next door. In that cramped space between buildings, she could see her entire future in Boston. Years of factory work and poverty, watching James grow up ashamed of his circumstances, forever explaining why they had no family and no place in respectable society. The alternative William offered was built on lies, but it was also built on hope. In Nebraska, she could be Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, widow of a beloved son, mother of a child who would grow up thinking himself wanted and valued. James would have opportunities she could never provide, education and connections that would let him make something of himself regardless of the circumstances of his birth. But accepting William's proposal would mean committing to a deception that would grow more complex with every passing day. James looked remarkably like Thomas, the same distinctive blue eyes, the same stubborn cowlick, the same expressions that had made Eleanor fall in love with his father. As he grew older, the resemblance would become impossible to ignore, especially for someone who had known Thomas his entire life. Eleanor spent the rest of the day wrestling with the moral implications of what she was considering. Was it fair to William to enter a marriage based on such fundamental dishonesty? Was it fair to James to build his future on a lie about his parentage? Was it fair to Thomas's memory to let his son grow up believing his father was a stranger? But fairness, Eleanor realized, was another luxury she couldn't afford. Life had not been fair to her when it took Thomas away before he could marry her. Society was not fair when it condemned children for the circumstances of their birth. Poverty would not be fair to James if it denied him the education and opportunities he deserved. Sometimes survival required choosing between competing moral claims, and Eleanor found herself choosing James's future over abstract principles of honesty and disclosure. That evening, she began composing her acceptance letter, weighing each word for its potential to either strengthen or undermine the foundation she was laying for their new life. She accepted William's generous terms while adding subtle details to her fictional background, a brief marriage to a businessman who had died in a railroad accident, leaving her with debts that required her to seek opportunities far from Boston's creditors. The details were plausible enough to explain her need for a fresh start, while vague enough to discourage too many specific questions. Eleanor had learned during her months at the boarding house that people were generally willing to accept tragic stories without demanding exhaustive proof, especially when those stories explained uncomfortable circumstances that might otherwise require awkward social accommodations. As she wrote, Eleanor found herself creating not just a new history, but a new version of herself. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield would be dignified but grateful, competent but appropriately deferential, devoted to her child but eager to contribute to her new family's welfare. She would be everything that Eleanor Hartwell had wanted to be, but never had the opportunity to become. The transformation began before she even sealed the letter. Eleanor started speaking to James differently, practicing the voice of a woman who belonged in a prosperous farmhouse rather than a boarding house room. She borrowed books from Mrs. O'Malley's small library and studied them for information about household management on a scale far beyond anything she had experienced in her own life. More importantly, she began preparing James for the journey that would take them both away from everything familiar and into a future that would be entirely different from anything either of them had known. She talked to him constantly during their daily routines, describing the wheat fields they would see, the farmhouse where they would live, the grandfather and grandmother who would love him as their own family. James, of course, understood none of the words, but seemed to sense the change in his mother's energy and mood. He became more alert and engaged, as if responding to Eleanor's growing confidence about their prospects. For the first time since his birth, Eleanor found herself able to imagine a future that included genuine happiness rather than mere survival. The money for their passage arrived within 2 weeks, along with detailed instructions for the journey, and letters of introduction to families along the route who could provide assistance if needed. William had also enclosed a small additional sum for appropriate clothing, recognizing that Eleanor might need to purchase items suitable for her new role as the wife of a prosperous farmer. Eleanor spent hours in Boston's better shops, carefully selecting garments that would present the right impression without exceeding her modest budget. She chose practical fabrics in becoming colors, styles that were fashionable enough to suggest good taste, but conservative enough to indicate proper, moral character. For James, she purchased warm clothing suitable for a Nebraska winter, along with toys and books that would help maintain his development during the long journey west. The preparations were both exciting and terrifying. Each purchase, each decision about what to pack and what to leave behind represented another step toward a future that could bring either salvation or disaster. Eleanor found herself alternating between periods of confident optimism and moments of pure terror when she contemplated the magnitude of the deception she was undertaking. Mrs. O'Malley watched these preparations with the mixed emotions of someone who had seen many young women leave her establishment for uncertain futures. On Eleanor's last evening in Boston, they sat together in the boarding house parlor while James played contentedly on the rug at their feet. "You're doing the right thing," Mrs. O'Malley said quietly. "That child deserves better than what you could give him here, and you deserve better than what this city would offer you as a woman alone." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced that deception could ever be truly right, regardless of its practical benefits. "I just hope I can make it work." William seems kind in his letters, but letters can hide so much. "Men are simpler than women like to believe," Mrs. O'Malley observed. "Give him a clean house, good meals, and honest affection, and he'll likely be more than satisfied with the bargain. The rest, well, the rest can develop with time if you're both willing to let it." As Eleanor tucked James into his traveling basket for the last time in the boarding house room that had been their entire world for 7 months, she whispered promises to both him and to Thomas's memory. She would give their son the best life possible, whatever that required. She would honor Thomas's love by protecting the child they had created together. And she would try to build something honest and good with William, even if it had to begin with carefully constructed lies. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with the kind of sharp winter air that made every breath visible and every sound seem amplified. Eleanor dressed carefully in her traveling outfit, checked and rechecked their luggage, and prepared to begin the journey that would either save them both or destroy any chance they might have had for genuine happiness. As the hired carriage rolled away from Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house toward the train station, Eleanor looked back once at the narrow building that had sheltered them during the most difficult period of her life. Then she turned her face toward the future, holding James close and whispering prayers to a God she hoped was generous enough to bless even the most complicated forms of love. The train that carried Eleanor and James away from Boston was a marvel of modern engineering, its polished brass fittings and plush velvet seats representing a level of luxury Eleanor had only glimpsed through the windows of establishments she could never afford to enter. William's generous provision for their travel had secured them accommodations in the first-class passenger car, where other travelers nodded politely and made small talk about destinations and weather, rather than studying her with the suspicious curiosity that would have greeted an obviously impoverished woman traveling alone with a child. Eleanor had carefully crafted her appearance for the journey, understanding that the persona she presented during these crucial days would establish the foundation for everything that followed. Her traveling dress was made of deep blue wool, cut in the latest fashion, but conservative enough to suggest refinement rather than frivolity. Her hair was arranged in an elegant chignon that added years to her actual age of 22, and she carried herself with the careful dignity of a woman who had known better circumstances before tragedy had required her to seek new opportunities. James, now 8 months old and increasingly aware of his surroundings, proved to be an ideal traveling companion for maintaining her carefully constructed identity. He was a beautiful child whose obvious good health and expensive clothing suggested careful upbringing rather than desperate circumstances. His bright blue eyes and ready smile charmed fellow passengers, particularly the elderly ladies who seemed to populate every train car and who invariably wanted to share stories about their own children and grandchildren. "Such a handsome boy," commented Mrs. Abernathy, a prosperous widow from Philadelphia who occupied the seat across from Eleanor. "He has your eyes, my dear, but there's something about his expression that suggests his father's influence as well." Eleanor managed a wistful smile while her heart raced at how close to the truth the observation had come. "Yes, he's very much like his father in temperament, strong-willed but gentle, if that makes sense." "Perfect sense," Mrs. Abernathy replied warmly. "My late husband had exactly that combination. Stubborn as a mule when he believed he was right, but the kindest man who ever lived. Such men make wonderful fathers, though I suppose the good Lord had other plans for your husband." The conversation continued in this vein for much of the first day, with Eleanor carefully constructing responses that reinforced her fictional history while gathering information about the social expectations she would face in her new life. Mrs. Abernathy had lived in farming communities throughout the Midwest and proved to be an invaluable source of knowledge about rural customs, household management, and the delicate politics that governed relationships in small towns. "Nebraska farming families are good people," Mrs. Abernathy observed as they shared the evening meal in the dining car. "Hard-working, God-fearing, practical to a fault. They value competence over refinement, though. A woman who can manage both will always be appreciated. The key is proving yourself useful before you worry about being liked." Eleanor absorbed this advice while managing the delicate task of feeding James in public without drawing unwanted attention. She had become skilled at anticipating his needs and maintaining her composed exterior even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her careful self-control. The rhythm of train travel, the constant motion, the regulated meal times, the enforced proximity with strangers required a kind of performance that was both exhausting and oddly liberating. For the first time in months, Eleanor found herself able to practice being the woman she wanted to become. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield was emerging from the careful construction of mannerisms, vocabulary, and social responses that Eleanor Hartwell had never had the opportunity to develop. This new version of herself was confident without being forward, competent without being threatening, grateful without being servile. The transformation was most evident in her interactions with James. Instead of the anxious hovering that had characterized her mothering during their months of uncertainty, Eleanor found herself relaxing into a more natural relationship with her son. She read to him from the books she had purchased for their journey, describing the landscapes they passed through the train windows, engaging him in simple games that delighted other passengers and reinforced the impression of a devoted mother. Traveling to reunite with family. On the second day of their journey, as the train crossed into Ohio and the landscape began to shift from industrial cities to agricultural countryside, Eleanor encountered her first serious test of the identity she was constructing. A well-dressed gentleman in his 50s struck up a conversation during lunch, introducing himself as Mr. Samuel Morrison, a grain broker who frequently traveled through Nebraska on business. "Whitfield, you said?" Morrison mused when Eleanor mentioned her destination. That's a familiar name in Nebraska farming circles. Fine operation, from what I understand. Your late husband's family, I assume. Eleanor's carefully prepared response came smoothly. My husband's brother has been kind enough to offer us a home. Family obligations, you understand, particularly with a young child to consider. Morrison nodded approvingly. William Whitfield, then. A solid man by all accounts, conservative in his farming methods but prosperous because of it. His family has been working that land for generations. You and your son will be in good hands. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Morrison sharing details about the Whitfield farm's reputation, the quality of their wheat crops, and William's standing in the community. Eleanor listened with growing amazement as she realized that her fictional late husband's family was even more prominent and successful than William's modest letters had suggested. Thomas was the younger brother, wasn't he? Morrison asked casually. I heard he passed recently. Consumption, I believe. Tragic business, especially for a young man with such promising prospects. Eleanor's throat tightened as she nodded. Yes. It was very sudden. He had seemed to be recovering. And then... She let her voice trail off in a way that suggested grief. Too fresh for detailed discussion, Morrison's expression grew sympathetic. I'm sorry for your loss. From what I heard, Thomas was well regarded by everyone who knew him. Intelligent, hard-working, but with a gentler nature than his older brother. William is respected but can be quite stern when business requires it. Thomas had a way of making people feel at ease that served the family well in their dealings with the farmers. This description of Thomas matched Eleanor's own memory so perfectly that she had to look away to compose herself. Hearing about him from someone who had known him professionally brought a fresh wave of grief, complicated by guilt over the deception she was perpetrating in his memory. Your son will grow up hearing wonderful stories about his father, Morrison continued kindly. The Whitfield family takes care of their own, and they'll make sure the boy knows his heritage and is raised with proper values. Eleanor managed to smile and nod appropriately, but inside she was reeling from the implications of Morrison's words. William's family was prominent enough that James's parentage would be a matter of community interest. People would be watching to see how much he resembled his supposed father, commenting on inherited traits and family characteristics that Eleanor couldn't predict or control. Moreover, if Thomas had been as well known as Morrison suggested, there might be people in Milbrook who had known him well enough to notice discrepancies in Eleanor's story. She would need to be even more careful about the details she shared, more precise in her construction of the fictional marriage that supposedly gave her a place in the Whitfield family. That evening, as the train crossed into Illinois and the landscape grew increasingly flat and agricultural, Eleanor sat in the observation car with James sleeping in her arms and tried to prepare mentally for the challenges ahead. The vastness of the prairie, stretching endlessly in all directions, was both beautiful and intimidating, suggesting a kind of isolation she had never experienced in Boston's crowded neighborhoods. She found herself thinking about the women who had made similar journeys before her, mail-order brides, who had left everything familiar to build new lives with strangers, pioneers who had crossed these same plains in covered wagons, immigrants seeking opportunities that didn't exist in their home countries. Many of those women had succeeded in creating good lives for themselves and their families, but many others had failed to adapt to the harsh realities of frontier life. Eleanor's situation was different from most mail-order brides because she carried the additional burden of her deception about James's parentage. Other women might struggle with loneliness, cultural differences, or incompatible personalities, but they didn't have to worry about their children accidentally revealing family secrets that could destroy marriages and community standing. As James stirred in her arms and opened his blue eyes to study her face, with that intense baby concentration she found both endearing and unnerving. Eleanor whispered promises she hoped she could keep. She would protect him from the consequences of her choices. She would give him the love and stability he deserved. And somehow she would find a way to build an honest relationship with William, despite the fundamental dishonesty that made their marriage possible. The third day brought them into Nebraska territory, where the landscape transformed into the kind of endless wheatfields Eleanor had imagined but never actually seen. The sheer scale of the agricultural operation was overwhelming. Thousands of acres under cultivation, grain elevators rising like cathedrals against the horizon, trains loaded with wheat heading toward distant markets. Mrs. Abernathy, who was continuing her journey to Colorado, helped Eleanor understand what she was seeing. "This is some of the richest farmland in the world," she explained as they stood together in the observation car. "The families who own these operations aren't just farmers. They're agricultural entrepreneurs managing businesses worth more than most city enterprises. Your new family is part of something quite significant." Eleanor nodded, though she was beginning to feel increasingly intimidated by the scale of what she was entering. Her experience with household management extended to maintaining a single room in a boarding house and managing the simple meals she had prepared on a hot plate. The thought of running a household that supported a major farming operation was daunting enough without the additional pressure of establishing her credibility with a community that had known and respected her fictional late husband. As the train approached Milbrook in the late afternoon of their fourth day of travel, Eleanor made her final preparations for the meeting that would determine the success or failure of everything she had risked. She changed James into his finest outfit, arranging his hair to minimize the cowlick that so strongly resembled Thomas's. She adjusted her own appearance with equal care, checking her reflection in the small mirror of the ladies' washroom and practicing the expression of grateful dignity she hoped would make the right impression on William. The train station at Milbrook was smaller than Eleanor had expected, a modest wooden building surrounded by grain storage facilities and loading platforms where the agricultural wealth of the region was transferred from farms to national markets. As the train slowed to a stop, Eleanor gathered their belongings and prepared to step into a future that could bring either salvation or disaster. Through the window, she could see a tall man in a dark coat standing alone on the platform, his posture suggesting both patience and careful observation. Even from a distance, she could tell this was William Whitfield. The serious bearing, the practical clothing, the way he surveyed the arriving passengers with methodical attention, all matched the impression she had formed from his letters. As Eleanor made her way toward the train's exit with James in her arms, and their luggage being handled by the porter William had presumably arranged, she felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. In a few minutes, she would either begin building the life she had dreamed of for her son, or she would discover that some deceptions were too complex to sustain. The Nebraska wind that greeted them as they stepped onto the platform carried the scent of wheat and earth and possibilities that stretched as endlessly as the horizon itself. William Whitfield was nothing like his brother, yet everything Eleanor had expected from his letters. Where Thomas had possessed an easy charm that drew people to him naturally, William commanded respect through quiet competence and unmistakable integrity. He stood a full head taller than Thomas had been, with broader shoulders that spoke of decades spent in physical labor, and silver threading through dark hair that suggested maturity rather than premature aging. His face, weathered by years of Nebraska sun and wind, was more angular than Thomas's had been, with deep-set gray eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with careful precision. When those eyes first settled on Eleanor as she descended from the train, she felt as though she were being assessed not for her beauty or charm, but for her capability and character, a sensation that was both intimidating and oddly reassuring. Mrs. "Whitfield," William said, removing his hat with formal courtesy as he approached. His voice was deeper than Thomas's had been, with a measured quality that suggested he rarely spoke without first considering his words carefully. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" "Very comfortable, thank you," Eleanor replied, grateful that her voice remained steady despite the racing of her heart. "Your arrangements were most thoughtful. This is James." William's attention shifted to the baby in Eleanor's arms, and for a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. He studied the child's face with an intensity that made Eleanor's stomach clench with fear. She had rehearsed this moment countless times during the train journey, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of watching William examine his own nephew's features while believing he was looking at a stranger's child. "He's a fine boy," William said finally, his expression softening in a way that transformed his entire face. "Strong features. He'll grow up handsome, I expect." He paused, his gaze moving between James and Eleanor with a thoughtfulness that suggested wheels turning behind those careful grey eyes. "There's something familiar about him, though I can't quite place what it is." Eleanor forced herself to smile naturally while her mind raced with possible responses. "People often say babies have that quality, reminding us of someone we can't quite identify. Perhaps it's just the universal look of healthy children." William nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation, though Eleanor noticed he continued to study James with subtle glances as he led them toward a substantial wagon hitched to two magnificent horses. The vehicle was clearly designed for both utility and comfort, with proper seats and a canvas cover that would protect passengers from weather while still allowing them to observe the countryside. "The farm is about 8 miles from town," William explained as he helped Eleanor into the wagon and secured their luggage. "The road is good, but it will take us nearly an hour with the horses. That should give us time to discuss practical arrangements before you meet my parents." As they rolled away from the train station and onto a well-maintained dirt road that stretched across the Nebraska prairie, Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the landscape. The wheat fields extended far beyond anything she had imagined, broken only by occasional farmhouses, barns, and the dark lines of tree windbreaks planted to protect crops from the constant wind. "How many acres do you farm?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about the operation she was about to join. 1,500 under cultivation currently, William replied, with another 500 in pasture for livestock. We employ 12 full-time workers year-round, with additional hands during planting and harvest seasons. It's a substantial operation, but it needs to be to remain profitable in today's markets. The numbers were staggering to Eleanor, who had never conceived of agricultural operations on such a scale. Her father had worked in a small shop in Boston, and even the largest businesses in her previous experience employed only a few dozen people. The Whitfield farm was clearly an enterprise comparable to the manufacturing concerns that dominated New England's economy. "Thomas wrote that the farm had been in your family for generations," Eleanor said carefully, testing the boundaries of what she could safely discuss about her supposed relationship with William's brother. William's expression grew thoughtful. "My grandfather homesteaded the original quarter section in 1852. My father expanded it gradually as neighboring properties became available. Thomas and I have been working together to modernize the operation. New equipment, improved seed varieties, better livestock breeding programs. He had excellent instincts for innovation while still respecting traditional methods that had proven successful." The pride in William's voice was unmistakable, but Eleanor also detected an undercurrent of grief that suggested Thomas's death had left more than just an emotional void. He was planning to take over more of the business responsibilities, wasn't Eventually, yes. Thomas had a gift for dealing with people that complemented my more technical skills. Buyers trusted him, neighbors respected his judgment, and he could negotiate contracts that satisfied everyone involved. William was quiet for a moment, then added, "His death has forced me to assume responsibilities I had hoped to share with him. It's been challenging." Eleanor felt the familiar stab of guilt that accompanied every reminder of Thomas's death and her son's role in continuing his bloodline. James was sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware that he was traveling toward a life built on secrets that could shatter the very family that was preparing to welcome him. "I hope I can help ease some of those burdens," Eleanor said softly. "I know I can never replace Thomas's contributions, but I'm eager to learn and to make myself useful in whatever ways I can." William glanced at her with an expression that suggested he was re-evaluating his initial impressions. "Your letters indicated considerable education and practical skills. May I ask about your background? Thomas mentioned you were a widow, but he was characteristically modest about personal details." Eleanor had prepared for this question, but actually answering it while looking into William's honest grey eyes proved more difficult than she had anticipated. "My late husband managed accounts for a small importing business in Boston. I assisted him with correspondence and bookkeeping, so I have experience with business records and commercial correspondence. My education was better than most women receive. My father believed daughters, as well as sons, should be prepared for life's uncertainties." "Wise man," William observed. "Running a farming operation requires skills in multiple areas. Household management, certainly, but also financial record-keeping, correspondence with buyers and suppliers, and coordination with the workers' families. My mother has been handling many of these responsibilities, but her health has declined significantly since Thomas's death." They were approaching a substantial farmhouse now, its white clapboard siding and green shutters presenting a picture of prosperity and careful maintenance. Surrounding buildings included a large red barn, several smaller outbuildings, and what appeared to be cottages for worker families. The entire complex was arranged around a central yard and connected by well-maintained pathways that spoke of efficient organization. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, and meant it. The scale and evident prosperity of the operation was intimidating, but there was also something deeply appealing about the sense of permanence and stability it represented. This was the kind of home where children could grow up secure and loved, where James could develop the character and opportunities he deserved. "My grandfather chose the location well," William replied with quiet pride. "Good soil, reliable water, protection from the worst weather. 3 generations of Whitfields have worked to improve what he started. Someday it will pass to the next generation." The implications of his words were clear, and Eleanor felt another wave of guilt as she realized that James, Thomas's biological son, was the natural heir to everything William was showing her, even though William would never know. Her deception wasn't just affecting her own future and William's. It was altering the inheritance patterns of a family that had worked for decades to build this prosperity. As they pulled up to the farmhouse, Eleanor could see figures moving behind, lace curtains, preparing to greet the woman who would become part of their family. In a few minutes, she would meet William's parents and begin the process of establishing herself in a community where everyone would be curious about Thomas's widow and her young son. "Before we go in," William said, securing the reins and turning to face Eleanor directly, "I want you to know that my parents are good people who will welcome you warmly. However, my mother in particular has been deeply affected by Thomas's death. She may ask questions about his final months that could be painful for you to answer. I hope you'll be patient with her grief." Eleanor nodded, though she was wondering frantically how she would handle questions about Thomas's final illness and death, events she had known nothing about until receiving the telegram announcing his passing. Of course, we all process loss differently, and I understand that you were all much closer to him than I was during his final days. William helped her down from the wagon, then surprised her by placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I want you to know that I'm grateful you've come. This house has been too quiet since Thomas died, and my parents need the hope that comes from new life and fresh possibilities. You and James represent a chance for healing that I don't think any of us fully understood until now. Before Eleanor could respond, the farmhouse door opened and an elderly woman emerged, moving carefully but with obvious eagerness to greet the new arrivals. Margaret Whitfield was smaller than Eleanor had expected, with silver hair arranged in a neat bun and kind eyes that immediately focused on the baby in Eleanor's arms. "Oh my," she breathed, approaching with the careful steps of someone whose bones protested sudden movements. "Oh, William, look at him. He's beautiful." Eleanor found herself being enveloped in a gentle embrace that carried the scents of lavender and baking bread, homely smells that represented everything she had dreamed of providing for James. Margaret's attention immediately shifted to the baby, and Eleanor watched with growing alarm as the older woman studied James's features with the intensity of someone searching for family resemblances. "There's something about his eyes," Margaret murmured, touching James's cheek with a finger that trembled slightly with age or emotion. "They remind me of... but that's impossible, of course." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "People often see family resemblances in babies. Perhaps it's just the general look of healthy children." Margaret looked up at Eleanor with tears gathering in her eyes. "Forgive me, my dear. Since Thomas died, I find myself seeing him everywhere, in strangers' faces, in shadows, in dreams. This little one just has such a familiar quality that it takes my breath away." William stepped forward and placed a protective arm around his mother's shoulders. "Mother, you're overwhelming our guests before they've even entered the house. Let's get everyone inside and settled before we subject Eleanor to the full force of Whitfield family attention." As they moved toward the farmhouse, Eleanor carrying James and trying to appear calm while her world tilted dangerously, she caught sight of an elderly man standing in the doorway. Henry Whitfield was tall like his son William, but bent with age and recent grief. His eyes, when they settled on James, held the same searching quality his wife's had shown. Eleanor realized with growing panic that she had underestimated the challenge of bringing Thomas's son into a household where 3 people had loved him deeply and would be unconsciously looking for traces of him in everything around them. The resemblance she had hoped would go unnoticed in a community of strangers was instead being scrutinized by people whose hearts were raw with loss and desperate for any connection to the son and brother they would never see again. As they crossed the threshold into the Whitfield farmhouse, Eleanor understood that her greatest test was just beginning. She would need to navigate not just the practical challenges of establishing herself in a new household, but the emotional minefield of a family whose grief made them see Thomas's ghost in his son's innocent face. The Whitfield farmhouse interior revealed a level of comfort and refinement that exceeded Eleanor's expectations. Rich hardwood floors gleamed beneath Persian rugs, while substantial furniture spoke of prosperity accumulated over generations. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, and Eleanor's breath caught when she spotted several images of Thomas, laughing with his brother at a harvest celebration, standing proudly beside a prize bull, graduation portrait from the State University with that familiar gentle smile that had captured her heart in Boston. "I've prepared the blue bedroom for you," Margaret said, leading Eleanor up a polished staircase toward the second floor. "It has a lovely view of the East Fields and catches the morning sun beautifully. I thought you might appreciate the light for tending to little James." The room was spacious and beautifully appointed, with a 4-poster bed, matching wardrobe, and a comfortable rocking chair positioned near tall windows that indeed offered spectacular views of the Whitfields stretching toward the horizon. Most importantly for Eleanor's immediate needs, a wooden cradle sat ready beside the bed, obviously crafted with loving care and lined with soft quilts. "This is far more than I expected," Eleanor said honestly, settling James into the cradle, where he immediately began examining the colorful quilt patterns with the intense concentration babies reserved for new discoveries. "You've been so thoughtful. In preparing for our arrival," Margaret's face brightened with the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen since their introduction. "It's been a joy to have something hopeful to focus on. This house has felt so empty since Thomas died, and having a baby here again." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Well, it feels like a blessing we hadn't dared to hope for." The emotional weight of Margaret's words settled heavily on Eleanor's shoulders. She was not bringing healing to this grieving family through honest love and new beginnings. She was building their recovery on foundations of lies that could collapse at any moment, potentially destroying their ability to trust or love again. "Mrs. Whitfield," Eleanor began carefully, "I want you to know that I don't expect to simply step into Thomas's place in this family. I understand that my relationship with him was brief compared to your lifetime of loving him. I hope you'll help me learn about him so I can share those stories with James as he grows up." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of gratitude rather than grief. "Oh, my dear, you don't know how much it means to hear you say that. I've been so worried that we might overwhelm you with our memories, or that you might feel we were comparing you to some impossible standard. Thomas was precious to us, but we understand that life must continue, and that James deserves to grow up in a house filled with love rather than endless mourning." Eleanor spent the next hour being shown through the farmhouse, learning the routines and responsibilities that would now be hers. The kitchen was a marvel of modern convenience, with a large cast-iron range, running water pumped directly into the house, and pantries stocked with an abundance of preserved foods that spoke of careful preparation for the long Nebraska winters. "We usually serve the main meal at noon for the farm workers," Margaret explained, indicating a long table in the kitchen that could seat 20 people. "Breakfast is smaller, just the family and foreman, but dinner in the evening is when we really come together as a household. William believes that eating together builds loyalty and communication among the workers." The scope of the cooking operation was daunting. Eleanor had never prepared meals for more than herself, and occasionally Mrs. O'Malley, yet she would now be responsible for feeding 20 or more people daily, managing food supplies for an entire community, and maintaining standards that reflected the family's position in the local agricultural hierarchy. "I hope you'll be patient while I learn your systems," Eleanor said, trying to project confidence while feeling increasingly overwhelmed. "I'm eager to contribute, but I want to make sure I understand your preferences and the workers' expectations before making any changes." "Nonsense," Margaret replied warmly. "You'll bring fresh ideas and new energy to routines that have probably grown stale through repetition. The men will appreciate variety in their meals, and William particularly values efficiency and innovation in all aspects of the farm operation." As if summoned by his mother's words, William appeared in the kitchen doorway, having changed from his traveling clothes into work attire that emphasized his impressive physical presence. Eleanor found herself studying his face, looking for resemblances to Thomas that might hint at family traits James would eventually display. The brothers had shared certain characteristics: the distinctive blue eyes that James had inherited, strong jawlines, and a particular way of tilting their heads when listening intently. But where Thomas had possessed an almost boyish charm, even in his late 20s, William carried himself with the authority of someone who had shouldered adult responsibilities from an early age. "I thought you might like to see more of the operation before dinner," William said to Eleanor. "Understanding the scope of what we do here will help you plan meals and household schedules more effectively." Eleanor accepted eagerly, recognizing both the practical value of the tour and the opportunity to spend time with William, away from his parents' unconsciously searching gazes. She bundled James warmly and followed William outside, where the November afternoon was crisp and clear with the kind of endless sky that made Nebraska famous. The barn complex was even more impressive from up close, revealing the sophisticated organization required to manage the farm's diverse operations. Holstein dairy cows provided milk and cheese for both the household and local markets, while beef cattle represented a substantial investment in the region's growing meat industry. The horse breeding program produced both working animals and riding stock that commanded premium prices from buyers as far away as Chicago. "Thomas was particularly interested in expanding our horse operation," William mentioned as they watched. "Several magnificent stallions exercising in a large paddock." He believed the market for quality riding horses would continue growing as cities became more prosperous and people had leisure time for recreational activities. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, recognizing another area where Thomas's death had disrupted long-term planning. Was he involved in selecting the breeding stock? Very much so. Thomas had an excellent eye for horse flesh and understood bloodlines better than anyone else in the county. These particular animals represent years of careful planning and substantial investment. William paused, studying the horses with obvious pride and underlying sadness. "I'll need to continue his work, but it was really his vision that shaped our current program." As they walked through the facilities, Eleanor began to understand the true scope of the responsibility she was assuming. The Whitfield farm wasn't simply an agricultural operation. It was a complex business enterprise that required coordination between multiple departments, careful financial management, and sophisticated understanding of national market conditions. Moreover, her role as William's wife would involve far more than household management. She would be expected to participate in community social activities, represent the family at local events, and maintain relationships with other farming families whose cooperation was essential for the region's economic success. The social aspect may be challenging initially, William admitted as they returned toward the house. Rural communities can be suspicious of outsiders, particularly those from cities. Your connection to Thomas will help, but you'll need to demonstrate your commitment to becoming part of the community, rather than trying to change it to suit urban preferences. Eleanor appreciated his directness, while also feeling another stab of anxiety about maintaining her fictional background. "I understand. I hope my practical skills will speak for themselves, and that any initial reservations will fade as people see my dedication to contributing positively." They were approaching the farmhouse when a rider galloped into the yard, his urgent approach suggesting important news. Eleanor recognized Dr. Samuel Bennett from William's description, the local physician who had attended Thomas during his final illness and who served the medical needs of farming families throughout the region. "William," Dr. Bennett called as he dismounted, "I was hoping to catch you before dark. I wanted to meet your new wife and offer my congratulations." Eleanor found herself being introduced to a man whose professional interest in her family's health could pose serious risks to her carefully constructed story. Dr. Bennett was perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from years of making life and death decisions based on limited information. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine, but his eyes held the analytical quality of someone trained to observe details others might miss. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said warmly, "welcome to Nebraska. I trust your journey was comfortable despite traveling with such a young child." "Very comfortable, thank you," Eleanor replied. "Your community's reputation for hospitality has proven entirely accurate." Dr. Bennet's attention shifted to James, who was awake and alert in Eleanor's arms, studying the new face with baby curiosity. "And this handsome fellow must be your son. How old is he?" "8 months," Eleanor answered, her heart racing as she watched the doctor's professional assessment of her child's development and characteristics. "A fine, healthy boy," Dr. Bennet observed, though Eleanor noticed his gaze lingering on James's distinctive blue eyes and the stubborn cowlick that defied all attempts at control. "There's something familiar about his features, though I can't quite place what it is. Perhaps he resembles his father." Eleanor felt William's attention sharpen beside her, and she realized this moment could be the beginning of her discovery, or successful deflection. People often comment on family resemblances in babies. I think all healthy children share certain characteristics that remind us of people we've known. Dr. Bennet nodded thoughtfully, but continued studying James with the kind of professional interest that suggested his medical training made him particularly observant about inherited traits and family patterns. "Indeed, though in my experience, certain features are quite distinctive within family lines. Eye color, bone structure, even expressions can be remarkably consistent across generations." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Dr. Bennet sharing local news and discussing the medical needs of the farming community. But Eleanor remained intensely aware of his continued subtle observation of James, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose solution remained just beyond his conscious recognition. After Dr. Bennet departed, promising to return soon for a proper social visit, Eleanor found herself alone with William in the farmhouse parlour while his parents prepared dinner in the kitchen. The evening light streaming through tall windows cast everything in golden tones that should have been peaceful, but instead felt charged with unspoken questions. Dr. Bennet seemed quite interested in James, William observed carefully. "He's delivered most of the babies in this county over the past 20 years, so he's probably naturally curious about children's development and family characteristics." Eleanor managed what she hoped was a natural laugh. "I suppose physicians develop professional habits that extend beyond their examining rooms. James does seem to attract attention wherever we go, perhaps because he's such a contented, alert baby." William nodded, but Eleanor noticed he continued to study both her and James with the same careful attention Dr. Bennet had shown. She was beginning to understand that life in a small farming community would subject every aspect of her story to scrutiny from people whose livelihoods depended on accurate observation and sound judgment. That evening, as the Whitfield family gathered around the dinner table for Eleanor's first meal as part of their household, she found herself navigating conversations that required constant vigilance about the details she revealed. Henry Whitfield, despite his grief over Thomas's death, proved to be a natural storyteller who regaled her with family history that she needed to absorb and remember for future reference. "Thomas was always the adventurous one," Henry said, his voice carrying both pride and sadness. "Even as a child, he was eager to explore beyond our boundaries, to experience life outside our farming community. I suppose that's what took him to Boston and brought him to you." Eleanor smiled and nodded, filing away this information about Thomas's character while carefully avoiding any specific details about their supposed relationship. Every family story, every shared memory, every casual observation added to the complex web of knowledge she needed to maintain her deception successfully. As James began to fuss with tiredness, providing Eleanor with a graceful excuse to retire for the evening, she realized that her greatest challenges lay not in learning new skills or adapting to rural life, but in maintaining perfect consistency in a fictional history that grew more complex with every conversation. Settling James in his new cradle and preparing for her first night in the Whitfield farmhouse, Eleanor whispered prayers to a God she hoped was forgiving enough to understand that some deceptions were born from love rather than malice, and that her lies were meant to protect rather than harm the people who had welcomed her with such generous hearts. Eleanor's first week at the Whitfield farm established a routine that was both more demanding and more rewarding than anything she had experienced in her previous life. Rising before dawn to prepare breakfast for the household and workers, she found herself managing a kitchen operation that rivaled the restaurants she had only glimpsed through windows in Boston's better neighborhoods. The scale required careful planning, efficient organization, and physical stamina she hadn't known she possessed, but it was the constant social navigation that proved most exhausting. Every interaction with farm workers, neighboring families, and community members required careful attention to the details of her fictional past. Eleanor found herself creating an increasingly complex mental catalogue of information. Which stories she had told to whom, what details about her supposed marriage to Thomas she had shared, how much various people knew about her background in Boston. The farm workers themselves proved to be a diverse group whose acceptance would be crucial to her success. John Sullivan, the head foreman, was an Irishman in his 40s who had worked for the Whitfields for over a decade. His wife, Mary, helped with laundry and heavy cleaning, while their 3 children regarded James with the protective interest of older siblings welcoming a new baby to their extended family. "You've got a way with the cooking that reminds me of my grandmother back in County Cork," Mary Sullivan told Eleanor during their 3rd day of working together. "Not the specific dishes, mind you, but the way you think about feeding people, making sure everyone gets what they need, not just what's convenient to prepare." Eleanor appreciated the compliment, while recognizing the underlying evaluation it represented. The Sullivan family wielded considerable influence among the other workers, and their endorsement of her domestic skills would determine how easily she integrated into the farm's social hierarchy. More challenging was navigating relationships with neighboring farming families, who viewed the Whitfields' new household arrangement with curiosity that bordered on investigation. The first formal visit came from Mrs. Rebecca Patterson, wife of the family whose property bordered the Whitfields' eastern fields. She arrived on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to welcome Eleanor to the community, but clearly intent on satisfying her curiosity about Thomas's mysterious widow. "Such a tragedy about Thomas," Mrs. Patterson said over tea in the farmhouse parlor, her sharp eyes taking inventory of every detail of Eleanor's appearance and demeanor. "He was always so private about his personal affairs. We had no idea he had formed an attachment during his business travels." Eleanor had prepared for this line of questioning, but actually deflecting it while maintaining an appearance of openness proved delicate work. "Thomas was wonderfully discreet about our courtship. He wanted to be certain of his feelings and my character before introducing me to his family and community. I respected his caution, though I regret we didn't have more time together before." His illness. Mrs. Patterson's expression suggested she was filing away every word for later analysis. "And your late husband? Thomas mentioned you were a widow when he met you, though he was quite vague about the circumstances. The fictional husband Eleanor had created for her correspondence with William required constant, careful management. Robert died in a railway accident before James was born. Thomas's kindness during that difficult period meant more to me than I could ever adequately express. It wasn't technically a lie. Thomas had shown her kindness during a difficult period, and she was raising a fatherless child. But Eleanor found herself increasingly uncomfortable with the accumulating deceptions required to maintain her story's consistency. "How fortunate that Thomas was able to provide such comfort," Mrs. Patterson observed, her tone suggesting layers of meaning Eleanor couldn't quite decipher. "He always had such a generous heart, particularly toward those in vulnerable circumstances." The visit continued for another hour, with Mrs. Patterson asking seemingly casual questions that Eleanor recognized as attempts to verify details of her background and relationship with Thomas. When the older woman finally departed, Eleanor felt drained by the effort of maintaining perfect consistency while appearing naturally grief-stricken about her fictional losses. That evening, as she helped Margaret prepare dinner while James played contentedly in a basket nearby, Eleanor found herself wondering how long she could sustain such careful performance. Every conversation required mental effort that left her exhausted, and she was beginning to understand that rural communities had their own sophisticated networks for sharing and analyzing information about newcomers. "You handled Rebecca Patterson beautifully," Margaret said quietly, apparently reading Eleanor's thoughts. "She's a good woman, but she does fancy herself the unofficial chronicler of everyone's business. The fact that she seems satisfied with your answers means word will spread that you're exactly what you appear to be." Eleanor felt a flush of guilt at Margaret's approval, knowing that the older woman's trust was based on carefully constructed lies. "I hope I didn't reveal anything inappropriate about Thomas. I know how precious his memory is to your family." "Oh, my dear," Margaret replied, placing a flour-dusted hand gently on Eleanor's arm. "You spoke of him with exactly the right combination of love and reserve. It's clear he meant a great deal to you, but you're not the sort of woman who displays her deepest feelings for public consumption. That's precisely the kind of discretion Thomas would have valued in a wife." The conversation was interrupted by William's arrival from the fields, accompanied by a man Eleanor hadn't met before. The stranger was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed in the manner of successful businessmen, with keen eyes that suggested intelligence and careful observation. "Eleanor," William said, "I'd like you to meet Charles Morrison, the grain broker I mentioned. Charles, this is my wife Eleanor, and our son James." Eleanor felt her heart skip as she recognized the surname. This might be related to the Samuel Morrison she had met on the train, who had known about Thomas's death and the Whitfield family's business reputation. If there was a family connection, this meeting could pose serious risks to her carefully maintained story. "A pleasure, Mrs. Whitfield," Charles Morrison said, offering a respectful bow. "I was deeply sorry to hear about Thomas's passing. He was a fine man and an excellent judge of agricultural markets." "Thank you," Eleanor replied carefully. Thomas spoke often of the business relationships that made the farm's success possible. He valued fair dealing and honest partnerships above all else. Morrison's attention shifted to James, who was beginning to show signs of wanting his evening meal. "A handsome boy. He has a familiar look about him, though I can't quite place why. Perhaps it's simply the characteristic look of healthy farm children." Eleanor felt William's attention sharpen beside her, and she realized this was becoming a dangerous pattern. Too many people were noticing something familiar about James's appearance, and their comments were clearly beginning to register with William as more than coincidental observation. "All babies tend to have universal features that remind us of people we've known," Eleanor said, repeating the explanation that was becoming her standard response. "James seems to have one of those faces that suggests family connections, even where none exist." Morrison nodded, but continued studying James with the kind of professional attention that suggested he was accustomed to recognizing patterns and making connections others might miss. "Indeed. Though I must say, there's something particularly distinctive about his eyes and the way he holds his head. Quite remarkable, really." The conversation moved on to agricultural business, but Eleanor remained acutely aware of Morrison's continued subtle observation of both her and James. When he finally departed after dinner, having concluded negotiations for the winter wheat harvest, Eleanor felt increasingly anxious about the accumulating evidence that multiple people were noticing James's resemblance to someone they couldn't quite identify. That night, as she prepared James for bed in their comfortable room, Eleanor found herself studying her son's face with the same analytical attention their visitors had shown. At 9 months old, his features were becoming more defined and individual, moving beyond the generic baby characteristics that had initially provided some protection for her secret. The distinctive Whitfield blue eyes were unmistakable now, as was the stubborn cowlick that defied every attempt at control. More troubling were the expressions that were beginning to emerge, a particular way of tilting his head when concentrating, a smile that transformed his entire face, gestures that reminded Eleanor painfully of his father. As James grew older, these resemblances would become impossible to ignore, particularly for people who had known and loved Thomas. Eleanor was beginning to realize that her deception might have a natural expiration date, after which maintaining the fiction would become impossible regardless of how carefully she managed the details. The crisis came sooner than she had expected. During Eleanor's second week at the farm, Dr. Bennet returned for the social visit he had promised, arriving on a crisp Saturday afternoon when the entire family was gathered in the parlour, enjoying a rare moment of leisure. Eleanor was reading aloud from a novel while Margaret worked on embroidery, and William reviewed agricultural journals. James was playing on a quilt spread across the floor, demonstrating the mobility and curiosity that came with approaching his first birthday. "What a delightful domestic scene," Dr. Bennet observed as Margaret welcomed him into the parlour. "It's wonderful to see this house filled with life and laughter again." Eleanor smiled and continued reading, but she was acutely aware of the doctor's professional observation of their family dynamics. As a physician who had attended the Whitfield family for years, Dr. Bennet understood their personalities, relationships, and characteristics with unusual thoroughness. "Young James seems to be thriving in his new environment," Dr. Bennet commented, settling into a chair where he could observe the baby's play. "He's remarkably alert and physically advanced for his age." "He's always been an active, curious child," Eleanor replied, trying to project the natural pride of a devoted mother while monitoring the doctor's increasingly focused attention. "Doctor..." Bennet was quiet for several minutes, watching James's movements and expressions with the kind of scientific interest that made Eleanor's stomach clench with anxiety. When the baby looked up and smiled directly at the doctor, displaying the full effect of his distinctive blue eyes and inherited charm, Dr. Bennet's entire demeanor changed. "My God," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of stunned realization. "Those eyes, that expression, the way he moves his hands when he's concentrating." Eleanor felt the world tilt dangerously as she realized that Dr. Bennet had made the connection she had been dreading. The physician was staring at James with the kind of recognition that came from years of professional observation and intimate knowledge of family characteristics. "Doctor?" William asked, clearly puzzled by the sudden change in his friend's behavior. Dr. Bennet looked up at Eleanor, then at William, then back at James, with an expression that combined professional certainty with personal shock. "William," he said slowly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you noticed anything familiar about James's appearance?" Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe, but she forced herself to remain seated and composed while her carefully constructed world began to crumble around her. William was studying James with new attention, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he absorbed the implications of Dr. Bennet's question. "Now that you mention it," William said slowly, "there has been something familiar about him since Eleanor arrived. I couldn't place what it was, but several people have commented on it." Dr. Bennet nodded grimly. "I've been struggling to identify what seemed familiar about this child since I first saw him. But watching him play just now, seeing his expressions and mannerisms in good light." He paused, his professional training clearly warring with the personal implications of what he was about to reveal. "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked. though her voice carried a note of dawning understanding that suggested she, too, was beginning to see what Dr. Bennet had recognized. Eleanor realized that her moment of truth had arrived far sooner than she had prepared for, and, under circumstances that gave her no opportunity to control the revelation or its consequences. She was about to watch her carefully constructed new life collapse in front of the people who had welcomed her with such generous hearts, and there was nothing she could do to prevent the destruction that was about to unfold. The silence that followed Dr. Bennet's observations stretched endlessly, broken only by James's happy babbling as he played with wooden blocks on the parlor floor, blissfully unaware that his very existence was about to shatter the carefully constructed world his mother had built around him. Eleanor felt as though time had suspended itself, giving her these final moments of peace before her deception unraveled completely. "Dr. Bennet," Eleanor said carefully, her voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." But even as she spoke, Eleanor could see the pieces clicking together in Dr. Bennet's mind with the inexorable logic of medical diagnosis. Years of observing hereditary traits, family resemblances, and genetic patterns had trained him to recognize connections that others might miss, and his professional certainty was written clearly across his weathered features. "Mrs. Whitfield," Dr. Bennet said gently, his tone carrying the careful compassion he used when delivering difficult news to patients. "I attended Thomas during his final illness. I knew him from childhood, delivered him when he was born, watched him grow into the fine man he became. I know every distinctive feature of the Whitfield family line." William was studying James with new intensity, his grey eyes moving from the baby's face to Eleanor's with growing comprehension. Margaret had set down her embroidery, her hand pressed to her chest as if trying to calm a suddenly racing heart, while Henry leaned forward in his chair with the focused attention of someone whose world was about to shift fundamentally. "What exactly are you saying?" William asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand the implications even as he sought confirmation. Dr. Bennet stood and walked closer to where James was playing, kneeling beside the baby with the gentle movements of someone accustomed to earning children's trust. James looked up at him with bright curiosity, offering one of his wooden blocks, with the generous impulse of a child who had known only kindness from adults. "Hello there, young man," Dr. Bennet said softly, accepting the block while studying James's face with professional thoroughness. "Those are remarkable blue eyes you have, very distinctive, and that cowlick—" He looked up at William with an expression that mixed wonder and certainty. "William, this child has Thomas's eyes, not just the color, but the exact shape, the way they crinkle slightly at the corners when he smiles, the particular depth of the blue. And look at his hands. Those are Whitfield hands, down to the way he holds objects when he's concentrating." Eleanor felt her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse, but she also felt a strange sense of relief that the exhausting performance was finally ending. "Dr. Bennet, I think you're seeing connections that—" "No," Margaret interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh my God, he's right. Look at him, William. Really look at him." She was studying James with the intensity of someone seeing him clearly for the first time, no longer filtering her observations through expectations and social conventions. The way he tilts his head when he's listening, the shape of his mouth. That's exactly how Thomas used to look when he was concentrating on something. William rose from his chair and approached slowly, as if afraid that sudden movement might shatter whatever revelation was unfolding. He knelt beside Dr. Bennet, studying his nephew's face with the growing wonder of recognition, and Eleanor watched as understanding dawned in his intelligent grey eyes. "Sweet Jesus," William breathed. "He looks like Thomas when Thomas was a baby. I remember the old photographs, the family portraits. This child..." He looked up at Eleanor with an expression that combined shock, hurt, and desperate hope. "Eleanor, who is James's father?" The moment of truth had arrived, and Eleanor realized that any attempt at continued deception would only make the situation worse. These people deserved honesty, however painful, and James deserved to have his true heritage acknowledged by the family who had already begun to love him. "Thomas," Eleanor said simply, her voice carrying the weight of months of carefully guarded secrets, "James's father is Thomas." The admission hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, creating a new reality that everyone in the room needed time to absorb and understand. Margaret made a small sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, while Henry gripped the arms of his chair with hands that trembled slightly with age and emotion. "Thomas," William repeated slowly, as if testing the word's validity. "My brother Thomas is James's father." Eleanor nodded, unable to trust her voice for more complicated explanations. She watched William's face as he processed the implications, that his supposed nephew was actually his nephew, that the woman he had married to honor his brothers. Memory had been Thomas's lover, that the child he had welcomed into his home carried the Whitfield blood he had never suspected. "But you said—" William began, then stopped as he realized the complexity of what Eleanor had constructed. "Your letters spoke of being a widow, of a late husband who died in a railroad accident." "I was never married," Eleanor said quietly, the truth feeling both liberating and terrifying after months of careful fiction. "Thomas and we loved each other. He promised to marry me when he returned from Nebraska, to send for me when his family's financial situation stabilized. But then the letters stopped coming, and I didn't know why until I received the telegram announcing his death." Dr. Bennett was nodding with the satisfied expression of someone whose medical instincts had been confirmed by evidence. The timing would be right. Thomas was in Boston 9 months before James was born, during that extended business trip to arrange new shipping contracts. "He never knew about the baby," Eleanor continued, needing them to understand that Thomas hadn't abandoned his responsibilities. "I discovered I was carrying James after the letters stopped. I thought perhaps Thomas had changed his mind about marrying me, or that his family had forbidden further contact. I never had the chance to tell him he was going to be a father." Margaret was crying now, but her tears seemed to be joy mixed with grief rather than anger or betrayal. "A piece of Thomas," she whispered, reaching toward James with trembling hands. "My grandson, our grandson." "But why the deception?" William asked, and Eleanor could hear him struggling to understand her choices rather than simply condemning them. "Why not tell us the truth from the beginning?" Eleanor took a deep breath, knowing that this explanation would determine whether the Whitfield family could forgive her choices or whether her honesty had come too late to preserve the relationships she had begun to cherish. "Because I was an unmarried mother with no family support and no means of providing for my child," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke her truth for the first time in months. "Because society condemns children for the circumstances of their birth, and I couldn't bear the thought of James growing up ashamed of his parentage. Because I was desperate and frightened, and saw marriage to you as the only way to give my son the life he deserved." She paused, looking directly at William with all the honesty she should have offered from the beginning. "And because I was afraid that if you knew James was Thomas's son, you might feel obligated to care for us out of duty rather than choice. I wanted to earn my place in this family through my own efforts, not simply claim it through James's blood connection." William was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through emotions Eleanor couldn't entirely read. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a complexity that suggested he was working through conflicting feelings in real time. "So, when you wrote about being a widow with a child, when you accepted my proposal of marriage, You were protecting James while deceiving me about the fundamental nature of our arrangement. Eleanor nodded, accepting the judgment she heard in his words. Yes, I'm not proud of the deception, but I would make the same choice again if it meant protecting my son's future. Our son, Margaret corrected firmly, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone in the room. James is our grandson, which makes him our son in every way that matters. Eleanor, dear, you've given us a gift beyond measure, a living piece of Thomas that we never dared hope to have. Henry spoke for the first time since the revelation began, his aged voice carrying the weight of family patriarch and final arbiter. The boy carries Whitfield blood. That makes him family, regardless of the circumstances of his birth. The only question is what we do with this knowledge now that we have it. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized that the Whitfield family's response to her deception was focused not on punishment, but on protecting James and integrating this new reality into their understanding of their family structure. Eyes. Understand if you want me to leave, Eleanor said quietly. I never intended to trap anyone in marriage through lies, and I won't hold you to vows that were made under false pretenses. But I hope you'll allow me to visit James, to remain part of his life even if I can't stay here. William was studying her with an expression she couldn't interpret, his grey eyes moving between her face and James's as if making calculations that went beyond simple arithmetic. When he finally spoke, his words carried a measured thoughtfulness. That was characteristically his own. Eleanor, he said carefully, you've deceived me about fundamental aspects of our marriage. You've built our relationship on lies that could have continued indefinitely if Dr. Bennet hadn't recognized James's resemblance to Thomas. I should be angry, and part of me is. But I'm also trying to understand the choices you made and the circumstances that led to them. He stood and walked to the window that overlooked the Whitfields, stretching toward the horizon, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture Eleanor had learned to associate with his deepest thinking. Thomas loved you, William said, his voice carrying certainty rather than question. I can see it in how you speak about him, in how you've protected his son, in the way you've honored his memory even while constructing a fiction around it. And James, he turned back to look at the baby, who was still playing contentedly while the adults worked through the implications of his existence. James is family. He's a Whitfield, and he belongs here regardless of anything else. Eleanor felt hope beginning to compete with her fear as she realized that William was working toward acceptance rather than rejection. What are you saying? I'm saying that we need to decide how to move forward with the truth instead of the fiction. William's expression was serious, but not unkind, as he looked directly at Eleanor. You came here as my mail-order bride, but you're actually the mother of my nephew, and the woman my brother loved. That changes everything about our arrangement. But it doesn't necessarily end it. Dr. Bennet cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps I should leave you folks to work through family matters privately. But before I go, I want you to know that this explains something that's been troubling me since Thomas died. He seemed lighter during his final weeks, as if he had found something that brought him joy, even in the midst of his illness. I think he was planning to tell us about Eleanor and arrange for her to come to Nebraska. His death simply prevented him from completing those arrangements. As Dr. Bennet departed with promises of discretion and continued friendship, Eleanor found herself alone with the Whitfield family for the first time since her truth had been revealed. The atmosphere in the parlor felt different now, charged with new possibilities, but also heavy with the weight of renegotiating relationships that had been built on carefully constructed foundations. So, William said, settling back into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a difficult conversation, where do we go from here? The silence that followed William's question stretched through the farmhouse parlour like morning mist across the wheatfields, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape everything they thought they knew about their future together. Eleanor found herself studying the faces of the people who had become her family. Margaret's hopeful expression, Henry's weathered features softened by newfound joy at having a grandson, and William's careful grey eyes that seemed to be weighing complex equations of duty, desire, and practical necessity. "Where we go from here," Eleanor said slowly, "depends entirely on what you're willing to accept. I came here under false pretenses, built our marriage on lies I thought were necessary to protect my son. You have every right to dissolve our arrangement and send me away, though I hope you'll allow James to remain where he belongs." William stood and walked to the window that offered views of the vast agricultural operation that represented generations of Whitfield labour and dreams. His posture, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders set with determination, had become familiar to Eleanor during their brief marriage, a signal that he was working through complex problems with the methodical thoroughness that characterized his approach to everything from crop rotation to business negotiations. "Eleanor," he said without turning around, "you've asked me what I'm willing to accept, but I think the more important question is what we're both willing to build. What happened before today, the deception, the fictional husband, the carefully constructed letters, that's the past. The question now is whether we can create something honest and valuable for the future." Margaret had been quietly observing this exchange while gently bouncing James on her knee. But now she spoke with the authority of someone who had watched 3 generations navigate the complexities of love, loss, and family obligation. "If I may offer some perspective," she said, her voice carrying the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of managing a farm household. "What we've discovered today doesn't change the fundamental reality that Eleanor has proven herself to be exactly the kind of woman this family needs. She's competent, caring, devoted to James's welfare, and has brought life and joy back to this house in ways we hadn't experienced since Thomas died." Henry nodded his agreement, his aged hands gripping the arms of his chair as he leaned forward to add his own observations. "The boy carries Whitfield blood. That makes everything else secondary. Eleanor is James's mother, which means she's family regardless of the circumstances that brought her here. The only question is how we choose to honor that connection." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized that the Whitfield family's response to her revelation was focused not on punishment or rejection, but on finding ways to move forward that protected James while acknowledging the complicated truth they now shared. "But what about the marriage itself?" Eleanor asked, looking directly at William. "You married me believing I was Thomas's widow, thinking you were honoring your brother's memory by caring for his supposed family. Now you know I was his lover, not his wife, and that our entire arrangement was based on deception. How can we build anything genuine on such a foundation?" William turned back toward the room, his expression thoughtful but not unkind. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about that question since Dr. Bennett made his observation about James's resemblance to Thomas, and I've realized something important. The woman you've shown yourself to be since arriving here, that person is real, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded, understanding the distinction he was making. "Yes, everything about how I've tried to contribute to this household, everything about my feelings for your family and my gratitude for the opportunities you've given James, all of that has been completely honest." "Then perhaps we can build on that honesty," William said, settling back into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a crucial conversation. "Eleanor, I'm going to share something with you that I haven't told anyone else. Thomas wrote to me about you." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "He did?" 3 letters during his final weeks. He never mentioned your name, and he was characteristically modest about personal details, but he wrote about a remarkable young woman in Boston who had captured his heart. He was planning to propose marriage when he recovered from his illness. Planning to bring you home to meet the family? Margaret was nodding with obvious satisfaction. Dr. Bennet was right about Thomas seeming lighter during his final weeks. He was making plans for the future, talking about changes he wanted to make to the farm operation, discussing improvements to the house that would make it suitable for a wife and family. Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the realization that Thomas had intended to acknowledge their relationship and claim James as his legitimate heir. Her elaborate deception had been unnecessary. Thomas had already been planning to give their son everything she had risked so much to secure. "So you see," William continued, "your arrival here wasn't the result of opportunistic deception, but the fulfillment of plans Thomas had already made. The circumstances were different from what he intended, but the outcome he wanted, having you and James as part of our family, that's exactly what has happened." Eleanor wiped away tears that seemed to be relief mixed with grief for all the worry and careful planning that could have been avoided if circumstances had been different. "But what does that mean for us? For our marriage?" William was quiet for a long moment, studying James as the baby played contentedly in Margaret's lap, displaying the kind of alert curiosity that suggested intelligence and strong character. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration and genuine hope. "It means we have choices to make," he said. "We could end our marriage, and you could remain here as James's mother and our family member. You would have a place in this household because James belongs here, but we would abandon any pretense of being husband and wife." Eleanor nodded, understanding that this option would provide security for James while freeing William from obligations he had undertaken under false pretenses. "What other options do we have? We could continue our marriage as originally arranged, a partnership of convenience that serves practical needs without romantic expectations. You would be my wife in name and social function, but we would both understand that the relationship exists primarily to provide James with a stable family structure." Eleanor could see the wisdom in this approach, but she also sensed that William was building towards something more complex and potentially more rewarding. "Or," William said, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that she had rarely heard from him, "we could choose to build a real marriage. Not the arrangement we started with, and not something based on the fiction you created, but something new that grows from who we actually are and what we've learned about each other these past weeks." The possibility he was offering took Eleanor's breath away. "William, that's generous beyond anything I could have hoped for, but is it realistic? Can you truly forgive the deception? Can you love another man's child as your own son? Can you build a future with someone who began your relationship with such fundamental dishonesty?" William stood and walked over to where Margaret was holding James, gently taking the baby into his own arms with the natural ease of someone who had already begun to think of himself as a father. James immediately reached for William's face with the trusting affection of a child who had never known anything but kindness from the adults in his life. "Eleanor," William said, his voice softened by the baby's presence, "I've been watching James for weeks now, teaching him to recognize farm animals, reading to him in the evenings, planning for his education and future. He's already become precious to me, not because of his connection to Thomas, but because of who he is as an individual. The fact that he's my nephew just makes that love more meaningful, not less." He paused, looking directly at Eleanor with an expression that was both honest and hopeful. "As for the deception, Eleanor, I can't pretend I'm not hurt by the lies, but I understand the desperation that motivated them. You were protecting Your child in the only way you knew how, using the only resources available to you. I can't condemn that kind of maternal devotion, even when it came at the cost of honesty in our relationship. Margaret had been listening to this exchange with obvious satisfaction, and now she spoke with the kind of maternal authority that had been guiding Whitfield family decisions for decades. "What William is trying to say," she interjected with characteristic directness, "is that he's already in love with both of you, but he's too cautious to admit it directly. Eleanor, you've brought joy and competence to this household in ways we hadn't experienced in years. William has been happier these past weeks than I've seen him since Thomas died. James has given us all a reason to look toward the future instead of dwelling on past losses." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush as she realized that her growing affection for William might be reciprocated in ways she hadn't dared to hope. "Is that true?" William's expression confirmed his mother's observation, while also revealing the depth of feeling he had been carefully controlling. "Eleanor, I married you thinking I was doing my duty to Thomas's memory, but somewhere during these past weeks, watching you work, seeing how you care for people, appreciating your intelligence and strength, I stopped thinking about duty and started hoping for something more personal." The admission hung between them like a bridge that could be crossed or abandoned, depending on Eleanor's response. She found herself thinking about the gradual evolution of her own feelings, how her initial gratitude and relief had slowly transformed into genuine admiration for William's character, appreciation for his kindness to James, and a growing awareness that the security she had sought might be accompanied by affection she hadn't expected to find. "William," she said softly, "when I accepted your proposal, I was thinking only about survival and providing for James. But these past weeks, watching how you treat your family and workers, seeing your patience with James, appreciating your willingness to forgive my deception, I've come to care for you in ways I didn't think would be possible after losing Thomas." The conversation was interrupted by James's happy babbling as he reached for the wooden horse William had carved for him, a toy that had quickly become his favorite, and which represented the kind of thoughtful attention William paid to details that mattered to the people he loved. "So," Henry said with the kind of practical authority that came from being the family patriarch, "it sounds like you're both dancing around the same conclusion. You care for each other, you're both committed to James's welfare, and you've proven you can work together successfully. Where exactly is the problem in any of that?" Eleanor and William looked at each other, and Eleanor saw her own mixture of hope and uncertainty reflected in his grey eyes. "The problem," she said carefully, "is whether we can truly trust each other after such a complicated beginning. Whether we can build something genuine when we started with deception and arrangement rather than natural attraction and honest courtship. Trust is earned through actions, not guaranteed by circumstances." William replied with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Eleanor, you've shown me who you are through how you've conducted yourself here. I'd rather build a relationship on that foundation than on whatever romantic ideal might have brought us together under different circumstances." Margaret was nodding with obvious approval as she watched this exchange, and Eleanor realized that the entire Whitfield family had already accepted her as a permanent member, regardless of how her relationship with William evolved. "If we choose to try building a real marriage," Eleanor said, "it would mean starting over in many ways, learning to trust each other completely, creating genuine intimacy where there was only practical arrangement, finding ways to honor Thomas's memory while building something that belongs to us." "Yes," William agreed, "it would be challenging, and there would be no guarantees. But Eleanor, I've been thinking about what Thomas would want for his son, and I believe he would want James to grow up in a house filled with love rather than mere duty. If we can create that together, if we can build something real from this complicated beginning, then maybe we can give James something better than either of us could provide alone." The decision, when Eleanor finally made it, felt both inevitable and revolutionary. She was choosing to trust not just William's good intentions, but his capacity for the kind of love that could transform arrangement into genuine partnership. "I'd like to try," she said simply. "I'd like to see if we can build something true from this complicated beginning." The months that followed proved that good intentions, while necessary, were not sufficient for creating the kind of marriage William and Eleanor hoped to achieve. They had to learn each other's preferences, habits, and emotional rhythms, while also navigating the social complexities of their unusual situation. Some community members responded to learning about James's true parentage with sympathetic understanding, while others maintained barely concealed disapproval that required careful diplomacy and unified presentation. But they also discovered unexpected sources of strength in their shared commitment to James's welfare and their mutual respect for the Whitfield family legacy. Eleanor's practical skills and genuine affection for farm life complemented William's agricultural expertise and business acumen in ways that benefited the entire operation. James thrived in an environment where his parentage was celebrated rather than hidden, growing into a confident, curious child who clearly inherited both his father's charm and the Whitfield determination. The transformation was perhaps most evident during the community's annual harvest celebration, held on a golden October afternoon when James had just turned 3 years old. Eleanor stood in the farmhouse kitchen, coordinating the preparation of food for over 100 guests, directing the efforts of women who had come to accept her as a valued leader in their farming community. Through the window, she could see James playing with other children in the yard, his laughter carrying across the space where tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by families who had learned to celebrate their shared prosperity. William was in deep conversation with other farmers about next year's planting strategies, but Eleanor noticed how frequently his gaze returned to her and James, with expressions of contentment that suggested genuine happiness rather than mere satisfaction with practical arrangements. "You look like a woman who's found her place in the world," Margaret observed, appearing beside Eleanor with a basin of fresh vegetables from the garden. "I remember when you first arrived. So careful, so worried about every word and gesture. Now you move through this house and community like you were born to it." Eleanor smiled, reflecting on the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone. "I suppose I've learned that belonging isn't something you're born with. It's something you create through choosing to invest yourself completely in the people and places that matter to you." That evening, as the last guests departed and the farmhouse settled into peaceful quiet, Eleanor found herself sitting on the porch swing with William, watching James chase fireflies in the gathering dusk with the boundless energy of a child who had never known anything but love and security. "Do you ever regret it?" William asked quietly, his arm settling naturally around Eleanor's shoulders with the kind of casual affection that had developed gradually but surely over the past 2 years. "The choices you made, the risks you took, the deception that brought you here." Eleanor considered the question seriously, thinking about all the ways her life could have unfolded differently. "I regret the lies," she said finally. "I regret the fear and desperation that made deception seem necessary. But I can't regret the choices that brought James to this family and gave him the life he deserves. And I can't regret finding you, even though I found you through such complicated means." William was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think Thomas would approve of what we've built here?" Eleanor smiled, thinking about the gentleman whose love had given her James and whose death had inadvertently led her to William. "I think Thomas would be happy that his son is growing up surrounded by love, that his family found healing through accepting us, and that we've learned to honor his memory by building something good from the loss of him." Years later, when James Whitfield had grown into a successful farmer and devoted family man in his own right, he would sometimes ask his mother to tell him stories about his father Thomas and his father William, understanding that he had been blessed with two men who had loved him enough to shape his character and secure his future. Eleanor would share carefully chosen memories that honored both men, while teaching James about the complex ways that love could manifest in a family. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Milbrook carrying secrets and desperation had become a matriarch whose wisdom and strength anchored 3 generations of Whitfields. The baby, whose very existence had threatened to destroy carefully laid plans, had grown into a man whose life proved that the best families are built not on conventional foundations, but on the conscious choice to love each other, despite, and perhaps because of, all the complications that make us human. In the end, Eleanor Whitfield had discovered something more valuable than security or social respectability. She had learned that truth, however complicated and painful, was always a more solid foundation for love than the most carefully constructed lies. And in teaching that lesson to her son and the family who had chosen to embrace them both, she had created a legacy that would endure long after the Whitfields of Nebraska had forgotten the desperate young woman who once stepped off a train, carrying nothing but hope and a baby whose father's love had made everything possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.